Mike, we went down this path a little bit with my oldest, and we're going to do it again in a couple of years with other of my kids. How competitive is it to get into these leagues? How does a kid go about doing that?
Well, it is competitive getting in there. Just like with the colleges, it's that same numbers game type of situation, obviously. There's more players than there are opportunities. So it is difficult, but basically you got to kind of understand first kind of how it works. So let's just take a look at the two most prominent leagues, the Tier 1 and Tier 2 leagues. In the USHL, they hold a draft for players each year. And the drafted players obviously have a leg up for spots on the team. And in the NAHL, they not only hold a draft, but they also tender players. And basically what a tender is, it's a commitment by the team that they're going to take that player and they reserve his rights. And it's kind of like saying that you're going to make the team to a large degree, but it's reserving the rights for that player specifically to that team in that league. Now, you can be drafted by both leagues because they're independent leagues, so that's important to note. But basically how it works is there's either drafting in the USHL or draft and tendering in the NAHL. Each summer, the junior A teams hold tryouts, sometimes one, sometimes more, a series of them. And they hold their draft beforehand. So your best opportunity, like I said, is if you could get to be pre-selected, tendered, or drafted. But basically they invite about 60 to 100 kids to these tryouts. And that includes both the kids that are returning veterans that are on the team that haven't graduated out or been picked up by college, and it includes all their draft choices and their tenders and all the other talent that they want to evaluate. So obviously, if you can end up being in a position where you're drafted, you're going to have a better situation because the club's predisposed to you. But they are going to evaluate a large number of players trying to get the best team possible.
Wow, that's a pretty complicated process. Is there any tips that you can give us to sort through that?
Sure there are. I mean, just like with the college selection process, which I'm going to cover about how to kind of choose and select opportunities that you might want to do with that, there are some things that you can use as gauges for the tryout process with the junior A team as well. First, of course, being what I said a moment ago, if you can be drafted or tendered, that's going to enhance your ability to make the club. But let's say, for example, what you really need to do is you need to take a look at the rosters of the clubs that you're thinking about going and doing tryouts for. Let's use the example of a club that has forwards. Typically there's 15 forwards on a team. And let's say that they've got 9 returning veterans. Okay. And let's say that they draft 8 forwards and you're one of those 8 forwards. Well, what does that tell you? I'll tell you what it tells me. It tells me that 2 of those drafted players aren't going to make that club in all likelihood. Now they may, but the 9 veterans really do have a leg up. I'm sure, as John will verify, veteran players are considered premium, are they not?
Oh yes, definitely. You
Very
need
much.
the experience. A lot of these teams, it's a business for a lot of these teams, and they want the more experienced players.
So assuming that the veterans can hold their spot, that really means there's only 6 openings for forwards on that team. So if there's 8 players drafted, 2 of those drafted ones are not likely to make it unless they can bump a veteran player. And it tells you that you have to be better than at least 2 of the other 8 drafted players. Now, if you want some more measuring sticks as to kind of figure out where you're at, another good rule of thumb to look at is where were you drafted. If you were drafted as a first forward, you probably have a little better predisposition and chance going in because that's how high the club thought of you. If you're drafted 8th, you know how much more work you've got to do. And that's not to even mention or consider those that go to the tryouts that aren't drafted. And clubs do drop veteran players, and they do sometimes take players that aren't drafted over draft choices. But if the purpose of answering your question is and what we want to do here today is to provide some measuring sticks, just take a look at the rosters of the clubs that you're trying out for. And if you're drafted, see where you were drafted, because if you do the math, there are some simple things you can do that help tell you where you're at. And that's just important so that you know what to do, as we'll discuss a little later.
You know, Mike, you talked about tenders as well. And when I was coaching junior A, there were a lot of times that we let tender kids go because another kid showed up better than him in a tryout.
Yeah, and I know from some of this team representatives that I've worked with in the last 5 or 6 years, I've heard that story too. I mean, it's not your typical story, but what happens here, and I think the point that you bring it up, John, it just stresses that point that we've talked about, and I'll talk about again later on. I mean, players really have to be dedicated and prepare themselves, and even if you're fortunate enough to be drafted or tendered, you can't just show up at training camp thinking, or at tryout camp thinking that you're going to make it, because if you show poorly, with 100 other players on the ice, and how many. Typically, maybe there's 10 to 15 returning players on the ice at a tryout camp because they don't get all of them back, but they get some of them to show up. And then you've got another maybe 20 or so drafted. So, I mean, you got, let's say, 100 players. You got 60 players that aren't drafted, and they all know that their only chance of making that club
is bumping somebody
out. Bumping somebody and impressing you. And so that's why we want people to understand where you're at depending on what your fortunes are as a hockey player, whether you're drafted or not, or tendered or not. But certainly, if you're fortunate enough to be drafted or tendered, that's an important leg up because it gives the club a predisposition. I'm sure you'd agree with that, John.
Very true.
But by the same token, the player can never relax and just assume he's got it made because better talent, you'll take the talent, right?
It's happened a lot of times.
Well, Mike, let's talk for a minute about the kids that aren't tendered, that aren't drafted. You said they sometimes have 3 or 4 tryouts. We all know kids, my kids included, get letters from these teams, come and try out. What kind of strategies should these kids be looking at?
I mean, what you really need to do is, like I said a minute ago, is you need to understand where you're at and kind of gauge where the team is at. So if you're not drafted, the point I want to make here is if you're not drafted, it doesn't mean that you can't make a junior A team. But realistically, it means that your challenge is going to be greater and that you're kind of on the outside looking in. You need to understand that going in so that you make intelligent choices as to what you do. So I think, and it's not just who you try out for, well, that's the first choice, but the other one is how many tryouts you do, because they do cost money, and they are a mental and physical grind. So it's important to take a look, particularly if you're not drafted, but even if you are drafted, to look at that team's roster and see where you fit, like I said a minute ago. See how many forwards, goalies, defensemen they have coming back. Understand where you fit so that you work hard at preparing for your challenge, knowing just how great it could be. And not that you shouldn't work hard anyways to be a good hockey player, but if you're not drafted, I really want people to understand where they fit when they go to that tryout, to know how great that challenge is so that they're not crushed if they don't make it, which is a possibility if you're not drafted. I mean, it's unfortunate, but some, as John said, some non-drafted players do make it.
Yep.
But I think we'd all agree that's a small percentage.
It's a very small percentage.
Very small percentage.
Yeah.